hold, how do you talk to people like me who are at that intersection in holding both?
Great question.
I'm sorry, Scott. That question, no, I was just going to say to you, Scott.
Was that on the list? No.
See, I was ready to answer the last question. I feel a pattern emerging. I did want to kind of say one last thing about the last question because, what's your name again, sister? Sophia. You took the words out of my mouth in terms of the way we treat different types of violence differently. And I think the other piece is that, to answer the first question, it's not just that black people are seen as violent, but we're seen as irredeemable, right? So in ways in which we've talked about things like restorative justice today, and you know, it's a lot easier to move in a white school, like my experience with restorative justice, pushing it into schools. When recently we were doing work around juvenile life without parole, and the Supreme Court had ruled that mandatory juvenile life without parole sentences weren't valid, and we just took a look at the list of like states that had eliminated juvenile life without parole. That had basically recognized, well, all young people are redeemable no matter what the crime is. It was like Utah, Nebraska, I can't remember that, but like, you know, it was not Mississippi. So I think that's a part of it, and we have to figure out how to deal with that. So this other question, this is a really tough one. I'm the father of a 4-year-old black girl, and you know, we've heard a lot from people today who have been victimized, and I think I would just come back to what I heard today from other folks. This isn't not my thinking on it, but that those people who are doing that damage to young black women and girls themselves have been victimized, and whether they need to be like separated, like given that space to reflect on what's happened to them, but also, you know, given the time to deal with that and not cause further harm. I could see, but I think I agree with what's been said, you know, throughout the day, that some people may need a timeout, but what they don't need is the current style that we use here in the United States. But you know, I think just going back to the panels from earlier today, you know, just really dealing with the fact that a lot of folks themselves have been damaged, and putting them in a prison is not the thing that's going to stop it. I think especially with sexual assault of children, really whatever gender, it's often somebody close to you. And I know you were talking about trafficking, but you know, related. And so if that person is going to be sent back to your family or your at least your neighborhood, you want to know that it's being fixed, not being exacerbated when they're going inside. So, you know, I think that's my thoughts on it.
I could tell how nervous you were. You were uncomfortable even talking about that. I think that speaks a lot as being a father of a young black girl, specifically, that it's uncomfortable to even think something like that. So I think this is why this conversation has and continues to be uncomfortable. But as that young black girl, I want to speak on how, you know, as I grew older and I started understanding the world around me, I understand each and every perpetrator that abused me in a different way. And it's not often, and it's not so true that it's the person has been victimized himself, has gone through the same thing, because a police officer raped me. He took advantage, no, I know. He took advantage of a situation where I was a victim, and he took me to the hospital to you know, check myself out, and he was taking me back, was supposed to be taking me back to the precinct, and what he did was pull me over in the street, dark street corner in the South Bronx, and he raped me, and I was 16 years old. So that speaks a lot. So there's trafficking in many ways, right? And so, but it started before that. It started when I was 9 years old, and I was this little girl being taken into the closet by her adopted father, you know, to make her feel better, you know, because I was in a pain. So it, like I said, it happens in many ways, but I think what I recognized was that when we hear a young or an older black or brown girl or woman speak to the violence, the sexual violence that's happened to her, or is happening to her, we automatically say, well, that's your lot in life. It's okay. There's a different conversation when it's me or it's Laura, right? Because the white woman or the white girl, well, what happened? What's going on? There's more investigation, there's more questions, there's more concern when it's her as opposed to me. Like I said earlier when I introduced and talked about how I got to be where I am today, I've recognized that throughout, that we feel and we have owned this. We have fed into this belief, first of all, that anybody black or brown is 3/5 of a person, of a human being. I don't know where they got that from. I have yet to find any book that can corroborate that makes that factual, but we have written it into law that black or brown people are 3/5 of a human being. And if you're a black or a brown woman, you are less than that. That whatever happens to you, it's because it's what you're here for. You were created for that, right? You are nothing. You are less than even chattel. And so it's okay that this happens to you. So when we hear that those abuses, that violence is perpetrated against black and brown girls, we automatically say, okay, well, that's what you're here for. It doesn't even matter. You're not worthy enough. You're not important enough. And so we carry that. For me, I carried that belief. I didn't even realize that I was carrying that. Well, it doesn't matter. So I stopped telling. Because the first time I told in school, I became a liar, right? And then it went on and on and on from there. And I recognized that everybody that was in place to help me in some way, shape, form, or fashion that represented a system in this society perpetrated the abuse also. From the police to a preacher. I mean, you name it.
Not this one, though.
Not that one. But I just want to be clear that it happens because as soon as we open our mouths to try to get help, it's like we're shut down because you think it's okay. It's not okay. So why do we do that? But we have to get out of this belief that black or brown girls are not worthy enough. We are human beings. We are worthy. We were created in the same way as you. We bleed the same way as you. We feel the same way as you. We walk and talk the same way as you. We are you. Yes. So once you shut yourself off and isolate yourself from out of our reality, that's where we go wrong. That's where we go wrong. Recognize the human being that is sitting here that might be a few shades darker than you, as I recognize the human being that's sitting in front of me that's a few shades lighter than I am. There is no reason to separate that. Until we look at ourselves and understand ourselves as a human being, we will not recognize that in anyone else. And we really have to get out of this belief that anybody that is a few shades darker are 3/5 of a human being. That is where we started at.
And Donna, I think what's so powerful about your words is that it speaks to the idea of the racial norms and mythologies that have to be overturned so that we can center the experiences of black and brown folks, including black and brown women and girls who have been victims and survivors of violence, right? Because the narrative is that if you are black and brown, you are perpetrator as opposed to one who has been hurt. And certainly we see that in the examples of how women of color are not believed when they say that they are victims of rape, that there is an unrapeability to black and brown women and girls that has historical roots in that mythology. So Alan, I know that a lot of your work is to try to take these conversations around the experiences of victimization and the experiences of those who have done harm and move away from this kind of calcified thinking. So if you could talk about how do we move this conversation of those who have been harmed and harmed into more of a conversation around our shared humanity.
Sure. So, and to link it a bit to the last question, I mean, these to me derive from the very definition of equity. Equity is not treating everyone identically, but treating everyone as equals, which means that forcing people, into the identical system, broken and flawed system that was created to serve the interests of the most privileged and powerful and to warehouse the least privileged and powerful, which is often what reform conversations devolve to, is not in fact creating equity, nor is it creating the kind of system we need. And similarly to your previous question, we need to be treating everyone who speaks up or who is not able to speak up because they are a survivor or a victim of harm with equal dignity. And that's going to be different. And it's a complex circumstance because it means that on the one hand, what you look like, where you come from, your gender, who you love, your sexual identity, the accent you have, should not determine the likelihood that you will be stopped on the street by police or anyone else, that you will be arrested, that you will be incarcerated. But on the other hand, your identity and the identity of communities needs to influence the way in which reparation and restorative justice is employed, the way in which we invest in different communities to prevent harm on the front end. That's a very nuanced point, and it's one that has not been part of our national conversation about either our criminal justice system or about issues of race. And so you see that 20th century conversation happening over and over again in ways that are not helpful. To try to get to the second part of your second question, I think we need to start with shared values. The idea that we need a system and a society that keeps all people safe and all communities safe, that prevents harm, that upholds the values of equal justice and due process and accountability. And this goes to your previous point, that impunity is the opposite of impunity isn't vengeance, it's accountability. And people should be equally accountable in ways that correspond to the lived reality. And we probably differ in this room about the extent to which a prison, excuse me, should be a part of that equation. But thinking more positively, I think we have a historic opportunity to tell our story, to tell a story that is rooted in those shared values. This is the first time in human history that we all have access to communications vehicles that allow us to speak with millions of people around the world and to hear from them, to organize amongst ourselves. And we need to be telling that story. It needs to be rooted in those shared values. We need to be sophisticated. We know, as Bruce said, that information is necessary but not sufficient to move hearts and minds. And sometimes the way in which we take the information we know in our community of reformers and bring it out in the world can be harmful. So, for example, if you go to a persuadable audience and tell them that 1 out of every 3 young men of color is in prison or jail, thinking that that proves discrimination, it proves what to them? That men of color are more prone to criminality. So we have to make sure that part of the explanation we're giving is about how our systems are unequal from the start, how the opportunity to avoid and prevent harm is unequal in different communities, how the way in which people are treated at every stage of our criminal justice system, including both the survivors and victims and people accused of crimes, and as we've noted, those are often the same folks. We need to be able to tell that story, and then we need to pivot immediately to solutions. How could our system be different? What's our affirmative vision for a system, and I don't mean just a criminal justice system, but for social systems that work, that keep us all safe, that uphold equal justice and accountability, that move us forward together. In this room, we have a remarkable brain trust of those values and solutions and ideas, and I think it's time that we work more tightly together to tell our story.
Mm-hmm. So, some of this rethinking and reframing of the criminal justice system has begun to happen around addiction, right? So we're having a conversation that is somewhat unprecedented, that those who are addicted deserve the opportunity for treatment and healing, right? But 10, 15 years ago, when the victim of addiction was a Black woman addicted to crack cocaine or a brown man addicted to crack cocaine, there wasn't a languaging, right, around health and healing. There was a languaging around intense systematic criminalization. In the juvenile justice system, we are finally hearing of a push and an act towards diversion as opposed to detention. And yet what we're seeing is that white juveniles are afforded that opportunity for diversion more than black and brown youth. So even as we're beginning to go in this different direction that speaks to these themes of health and healing and beyond incarceration, we still see racial inequity. So I want to ask the panel, what do we do around that?
John Powell has a very powerful frame called targeted universalism that takes seriously the situatedness of people, that people are that universal strategies do not create universal outcomes. That in many respects, we have to take serious people's situatedness and respond in kind with a particular set of interventions and responses that honor their particular humanity, that honor their particular challenge or barriers. If we're all trying to get to the roof of a building, some folk may have to scale the wall. Some folk may have to take the stairs. Some folk may have access to an escalator. Someone else may have access to an elevator. Some folk may be in a wheelchair. So how do you take seriously that getting to the roof is the universal goal, but the way in which we get there will require a targeted intervention? And in that way, I think it takes serious the racialized nature of how these realities play out. We have to be clear, I think, and center the truth around racism in these conversations. A wonderful book by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, many of you may have read, called The Condemnation of Blackness, really kind of makes a historical connection between how black became equal with criminality and how that has been the basis for a lot of criminology and sociology conversations since the early 1900s. That has been the kind of groupthink. How do we take seriously that if we're serious about addressing addiction, that you can't just bring in a public health model into a communities of color and not take seriously that historical notions of criminality being linked to blackness has to also be dismantled along with the issues related to the addiction, the physiological nature of addiction that has less to do with race. It just has to do more with often place and location. I mean, it requires a certain level of depth that I think we have shown we're not willing to extend to people of color and poor folk in this country. We want to simplify our solutions to very complex historical problems. And so I do think part of the work that we have to do is take seriously where people are, slow the process down, but make sure our investments, make sure we as practitioners are doing simple things like anti-racism courses. How many of us have gone through anti-racism courses in the course of our organizations, philanthropy? If you're a district attorney, a prosecutor, a pastor, a teacher, how do you take seriously that there are things about racial hierarchy that we have not interrogated, and how can we have a racial justice outcome if we don't fully understand race, understand class, understand situatedness? These are the things that I think we can apply across the board, whether it's violence, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's public health, but we have to take, I think, those approaches very seriously.
You know, I would add on the policy side that we actually have a regulatory framework to work from. Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that, at least the regulations behind, I'm going to go law geek on you for a second, the regulations implementing Title VI say that if you receive federal funds, which is the case of every law enforcement system in almost every city and hamlet, the way in which you administer your system cannot be intentionally discriminatory, nor can it have a discriminatory effect. That has never been adequately enforced. It was not enforced in the last administration. My hopes are not high that it will be enforced in this administration, though, you know, we'll see. But the law exists, right? So it's on one of the many things that are incumbent on all of us as part of our activism, as part of our communications, our research, our advocacy, is to call on and insist on compliance with that law that has been on the books for half a century and has never been adequately enforced in the context of the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I, like Alan, a lawyer, I think the longer I practice law, the less faith I have in its ability to deal with particularly this question. Mm-hmm. And I am reminded over and over again of a very short phrase by Ella Baker, who said, "Until the killing of black mothers' sons is as important as the killing of white women's sons, white mothers' sons." That's the issue. We as a country have to be willing, and we as individuals have to be willing to do an in-depth reflection of our refusal to appreciate the inherent humanity of people who are different from us, people who have more melanin in their skin than us, people who may have a disability, be it physical or mental, people who may have a different sexual preference than us. We are so connected to otherizing and distancing as opposed to recognizing our common shared humanity that we will never get out of this problem until we get to that. And that means we have to be willing to condemn that part of us that has been so willing to condemn somebody else.
So I think there's a really deep question, right? And as I hear it, the question is, in those times of leniency and compassion, why is that more readily extended to whites than blacks? What are the conditions under which that happens, whether it's in juvenile justice or in the context of the opioid crisis? And I think it's getting at something very deep. And I agree with both of my co-panelists that I think part of getting there involves a very significant cultural change, actually. And so how do we bring that about? How do we bring about cultural change to try and affirm the bonds of social solidarity across all of American society? What does that look like? And I think cultural practices have to change. And so concretely, what does that mean? It means coming to terms with history. It means things like the proliferation of museums that record the reality of slavery, for instance. It means small rituals in public gatherings like this. If we're in Australia right now, this meeting would have started with someone saying, "I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Warumpi people who were here for thousands of years before us." We could acknowledge those histories as well in everyday small rituals. So I think that might be one way of getting towards this cultural change. And then, of course, there are the large questions of things like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, the equivalent of war crimes tribunals and so on. These are the mechanisms in post-conflict societies in which the bonds of social solidarity are trying to be re-established after they've been torn apart. And maybe this is one of the conversations we need to have.
Yeah, just quickly on this question of culture shift, I feel like this is what it really comes down to. Alan, first of all, you said you were recovering, but that was very constitutional. But keep working on it. Yeah, I think when you started talking, I immediately was like, well, it's not going to do us a lot of good right now, is it? What we were reminded of, I think, in November is there is still this huge, portion of the country that's very open to the other side's message. I feel like we've been talking about the elephant in the room all day around violence, but the other elephant that we haven't talked about is people who are pushing the exact opposite, approach, and they are running the country right now. So to me, it feels really important that we are able to shift from this place where we're at now, where half the country is very open to that, to their message around this kind of law and order agenda, but the way that we have been trying to approach culture shift at Color of Change is around things beyond, the criminal justice law, but also how do people understand the criminal justice system? People don't understand the criminal justice system. So a lot of our work is also around mass media, whether it is the news media and how they report on crime. We did a study on crime reporting here in New York that showed that, there was this huge disparities in terms of the reporting on crimes committed by Black folks, for instance, and the language they would use in that regard. We have a Hollywood team that works with producers, writers, things in Hollywood, both to present more, I shouldn't say positive, but more full images of Black people, but also to push back on these mythologies around the criminal justice system. Most people's understanding of the criminal justice system is based on what they see on Law and Order, right? And these are people who, God bless the Opportunity Agenda for the amazing messaging research, but they may never hear that message, right? So, but they're definitely gonna watch TV every night, right? So how do we intervene in those spaces? And I think it goes into a lot of other spaces, like when you see conservative efforts to purge history books, of the story of race and the murder, just like you were saying. We don't honor that. Not only do not honor it, there's a conscious effort to erase what has been put there. So I think we have to fight back on that. So we really want to get to the root of this issue, which is how Black folks are perceived, what our value is, whether we're redeemable, and how we should be treated when when we commit some harm against somebody else.
Okay, Donna, you're gonna wrap us up.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what he said, because that's what I was thinking too. Instead, get out of the, I spent 27 years in prison, and I did a lot of talking there and stuff, and wanted to see things happen. So I come out here now, so I'm a thinker and a doer, right? And I tend to lean more towards doing. And one of the things that I feel like we should do, that I'm recognizing, there are ads now, right? There are commercials on TV about substance abuse, right? Heroin addicts or whatever. They're all white. Every image, every person that you see, white female, white male, whatever, you see scenarios where it's all white. But we know that this has been going on in Black and brown communities for a long time, right? But we're not seeing those faces. We're not seeing those stories. We're not seeing those images on TV. So to piggyback, right, on that is that we have the ability to create our own narratives. We can tell our own stories. And our allies along with us can do the same thing. So how do we do that? Opportunity Agenda, Color of Change, right? Color of Change. I mean, so many others. Why don't we create our own stories, our own media, our own attention, and bring it to the forefront and say, hey, the more we put our faces or the faces of our community out there, the more it has the ability to change the mindset, to bring, there's compassion in this world, and we have to tap into that. We think everything is so negative and so violent, but there is compassion in the world. There is compassion in the world, and we can tap into that. So create our own narratives. Show a Black or brown person as a human being. Show that they have issues also. They have trials and tribulations, just like everyone else, and show what they go through, and humanize that person. I don't want to keep seeing a commercial or whatever that just shows one set of people. The world is not one set of people. Right? And so our communities definitely are not one set of people. And we have the ability right here and outside of this room to do that. So statistics are fine, numbers are good, I'm a researcher also, but what got to me was the qualitative effect of what I face inside prison. That there were more stories like me when I thought I was alone in what I was going through and what had happened to me. When I heard the stories of other women, I was like, oh my God. And that's what needs to happen. So let's do that. Let's do that.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel as well.
And I know we are past time. I dare any of you to tell me who you would have had us shorten to get us out of here on time. If you have a thought about that, feel free to bring it to me directly. But want to thank you for your attention, your patience, your presence here. Thank the folks on the live stream. And we are so grateful to be in this with you and so hopeful about what's ahead. Thank you, everybody.